August 1944. A humid night settles over Tokyo like a heavy curtain, trapping the heat rising from a capital already bruised by months of air raid alarms. Inside the dim corridors of the Navy Ministry, a single room glows with the cold white light of a shaded lamp. The windows are blacked out. The air smells faintly of ink, dust, and the quiet tension of men who already know the answers they fear. A courier steps in, carrying a thin folder wrapped in twine. No flourish, no ceremony, just a document, numbers, charts, production curves, loss tallies, compiled by analysts who have watched Japan's fleet shrink while America's grows faster than shipyards can update their chalkboards. At the long table, senior officers lean forward as the folder is opened. No one speaks. They study the graphs showing American shipbuilding towering like a cliff face, aircraft output beyond anything the Japanese home islands could ever hope to mirror, and the relentless tightening of a submarine blockade that is starving the empire of fuel. For a long moment, nothing moves. Because in that room, on that night, Japan's leadership begins to understand a truth too stark to ignore, one that will define everything that follows. To understand why that single report cut so deeply into Japan's wartime leadership, we must step back to the years when the empire still believed victory, if not guaranteed, was at least possible. In late 1941, Japan entered the war with confidence shaped by decades of rapid industrial growth, naval tradition, and a string of decisive victories across East Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships, and early advances across the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies seemed to confirm a long-held belief that Japan could seize a defensive perimeter, fortify it, and negotiate from strength. But those early triumphs masked a fragile foundation. Japan's industrial capacity was roughly one-tenth that of the United States. Its oil reserves, even after capturing the Dutch fields, were limited, and its shipyards, though capable, could not replace carriers, cruisers, or trained aviators at anything approaching American speed. Yet of all these weaknesses, the one least appreciated in the early years was the unavoidable geometric disadvantage that Japan had initiated a war of attrition against a nation built for attrition. The turning points came faster than many Japanese officers expected. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 cost the Imperial Navy 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, losses that senior staff publicly downplayed but privately understood as catastrophic. Even more damaging was the steady erosion at Guadalcanal from August 1942 to early 1943, where Japan's elite naval aircrews were drained away in a months-long struggle for control of Henderson Field. Through 1943, American shipyards accelerated beyond anything the world had seen. Liberty ships slid into the water in mere days. New Essex-class carriers appeared with a regularity that Japanese intelligence officers initially refused to believe. Hellcat production soared. The U.S. Army Air Forces expanded across the Central Pacific, and the industrial curves, simple charts drawn in black pencil on white paper, began to expose the scale of the imbalance. Inside Tokyo's naval and army ministries, these numbers created a quiet but growing unease. The empire could still inflict losses, it could still fight fiercely, but it could no longer shape the war. And by early 1944, more grim signals arrived. American submarines had begun choking Japan's maritime lifelines. Tankers sank with their fuel still aboard. Merchant losses outpaced production. Dry docks remained full, while frontline units waited for ships that would never come. It was in this moment, when optimism had given way to strain, that analysts began compiling the data that would eventually be delivered in that dimly lit room. A data set meant not to shock, but to warn. By mid-1944, the war's balance no longer merely leaned against Japan, it had collapsed entirely. The Mariana Islands campaign in June and July delivered the clearest proof. When American forces assaulted Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they struck not just at territory, but at the very core of Japan's defensive perimeter. The Imperial Navy attempted to respond, launching what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What followed was a one-sided contest of technology, training, and industry. In the span of 2 days, Japan lost more than 300 carrier aircraft and many of the pilots who flew them. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japan, it was something far worse, the functional end of its ability to contest the skis. Carriers returned to port nearly empty, some never returned at all. And for those inside the Navy Ministry, the meaning was painfully clear. Future battles would be fought under skis controlled by the enemy. The fall of Saipan carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. With American B-29 bombers now within range of the home islands, Japan's industrial centers, military arsenals, and civilian population were exposed. The Imperial General Headquarters privately acknowledged that the loss was decisive. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed under the weight of the defeat, a political tremor that reflected the broader strategic crisis. As Japan's perimeter shrank, its supply lines withered. American submarines, once dispersed, now coordinated and supported by improved radar, code-breaking, and more aggressive doctrine, ravaged Japanese shipping. Tankers carrying precious oil from the Dutch East Indies vanished beneath the waves in startling numbers. Steel, rubber, food, and ammunition shipments faced the same fate. By late 1944, Japan had lost over half its merchant fleet, and with it, the ability to sustain prolonged warfare. Inside Tokyo, analysts tracked these losses with growing alarm. They charted the disappearance of convoys, the dwindling fuel reserves, and the increasing number of aircraft grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Reports circulated quietly between the Navy Ministry, Army General Staff, and Imperial Palace. Each month, the numbers worsened. Each month, the questions became harder to ignore. The empire could still fight, but could it project force? Could it defend its skis? Could it move fleets across the vast Pacific? And most fundamentally, could it confront a nation whose industrial output was accelerating rather than weakening? By the final months of 1944, those questions converged into a brutal truth. The empirical data no longer described a challenging war. It described an impossible one. Exhaustion of an empire. By late 1944, Japan's war effort leaned heavily on men who were physically present but increasingly absent in strength. Aviators trained in months instead of years. Sailors who had survived earlier battles carried the fatigue of unending deployments. Ground crews worked through nights illuminated by the dull glow of distant fires. Inside factories, older men, women, and students assembled aircraft with diminishing supplies and constant pressure. The human reservoir that had fueled Japan's early advances had thinned. When analysts compiled personnel data into the report, the numbers reflected an undeniable truth. America's manpower pool dwarfed Japan's by a scale that made long-term war impossible to sustain. This human depletion formed the first pillar of the report's grim conclusion. Battles Japan could no longer shape. The second angle concerned battlefield realities. From 1942 onward, Japan had relied on tactical brilliance, night fighting skills, and the ferocity of its pilots to level the playing field. But by 1944, those strengths had eroded. American radar-directed fighter control nullified night tactics. Superior aircraft such as the F-6F Hellcat and the SB-2C Helderva shifted the balance of air power. Carrier task forces operated with unprecedented coordination, and amphibious assaults moved with precision. Tactical analyses inside the report showed what frontline commanders already sensed. Japan no longer had the initiative. It could react, it could counterattack, but it could not dictate terms. The data charted losses at the Philippine Sea, the long attrition around New Guinea, and the relentless pressure across the Marianas, proof that tactical ingenuity could no longer compensate for overwhelming American strength. The Imperial Navy and Army had long operated with competing visions and fragmented planning. Naval officers prioritized a decisive fleet battle. Army strategists focused on continental expansion and the defense of Manchuria and China. By the final years of the war, this division had become an institutional fracture. Leadership disagreements appeared in the margins of memos, in contested budget requests, and in contradictory defensive strategies. When the report reached senior leaders, it confronted not only the nation's material limitations, but also its fractured decision-making. The numbers demanded a unified response. The leadership was in no position to give one. This internal discord deepened the report's impact, for it revealed a reality that no single faction could solve alone. A war Japan could no longer out-innovate. Japan entered the war with formidable weapons, the Zero fighter, long-range torpedoes, and excellent night optics. But by 1944, those advantages had evaporated. American radar evolved rapidly, guiding fighters in darkness, detecting ships beyond the horizon, and coordinating interceptions with a precision Japan could not match. On the seas, the new Essex-class carriers carried larger air groups than Japan's surviving flat-tops combined. The report compared technologies side by side: American proximity fuses, B-29 long-range bombers, improved submarine torpedoes, and mass-produced radar sets. Japan's engineers were talented, but they lacked materials, fuel, and crucially time. Technological gaps widened monthly. The report's charts showed the disparity growing not linearly, but exponentially. This was not a temporary disadvantage. It was a structural one, and it confirmed what many officers already knew: Japan no longer controlled the pace of innovation. At the center of the report lay the single most decisive angle: industry. Japan's factories worked continuously, but shortages of steel, aluminum, and fuel crippled output. Allied bombing increasingly disrupted production lines. Rail transport slowed. Meanwhile, American industry surged to levels previously unimaginable. The US built carriers faster than Japan could repair damaged destroyers. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the tens of thousands. Fuel reserves were so vast that US naval task forces operated with near-limitless freedom across the Pacific. An internal table within the report compared output directly: ships, planes, ammunition, fuel, and merchant shipping. Every column tilted overwhelmingly toward the United States. For Japan's high command, this was the most devastating revelation. No tactic, no courage, no defensive line could compensate for numbers of this magnitude. The report made that clear in its final industrial assessment. An invasion of America was not simply risky, it was inconceivable. Beyond calculations and charts lay a quieter angle: the moral one. Japan's people endured years of rationing, air raids, and growing uncertainty. Families saw sons drafted younger each year. Cities darkened under blackout regulations. Rumors spread of losses that officials did not officially acknowledge. Inside the armed forces, morale eroded as fuel shortages grounded aircraft and stranded ships. The report's authors included a section on national endurance, how long Japan could sustain such immense pressure. The conclusion was measured but unmistakable: the empire's psychological resilience was weakening. Morale was finite, and in total war, morale was a resource as critical as oil or steel. The turning point began long before the report reached the polished table in Tokyo. It took shape across a chain of events, unfolding through 1944 and early 1945, each one tightening the boundaries of Japan's strategic options. These events did not occur in isolation. They formed a sequence, a mounting pressure that would culminate in the chilling conclusion presented to the high command. The first decisive blow came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle of the Pacific War, and in many respects, the final act of Japan's carrier fleet as a coherent fighting force. Admiral William Halsey's fast carriers struck with overwhelming air power. Japanese battleships, cruisers, and carriers maneuvered with determination, but the disparity was no longer a matter of tactics, it was structural. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and over a dozen destroyers in the span of a few days. The remaining vessels limped home with empty fuel tanks and decimated crews. For analysts in Tokyo, the implications were immediate. The loss of the fleet meant Japan could no longer challenge American movements across the Pacific. The empire had hoped to inflict heavy casualties and force a negotiated settlement. Instead, the US landed troops in the Philippines with near-total naval and air supremacy. On paper and on maps, Japan still possessed defensive lines stretching across Southeast Asia. In reality, they were lines without reinforcement, supply, or strategic flexibility. Then came the capture of Iwo Jima in March 1945, a battle fought with extraordinary ferocity. When American forces seized the island's airfields, B-29 bombers gained a crucial emergency landing site, dramatically improving the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands. Analysts incorporated these developments into the report, noting how airfields once considered distant suddenly created direct pathways for intensified attacks. The next blow followed swiftly. Okinawa, April to June 1945. The Imperial Navy committed its last operational battleship, Yamato, on a one-way mission. Starved of fuel, escorted by a handful of destroyers, Yamato sailed into a sea controlled entirely by American carriers. Waves of aircraft struck with relentless precision. In less than 2 hours, the world's largest battleship rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. For Japanese staff officers, Yamato's destruction represented more than the loss of a symbol. It was mathematical proof that even their most powerful vessels were irrelevant in the face of American air dominance. By the time Okinawa fell, American planners were already preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. They projected terrifying casualties on both sides. Yet even these grim numbers underscored a hard truth: the United States could endure such losses. Japan could not. By early summer 1945, metrics flowed into Tokyo from every direction. Fuel levels, ship losses, aircraft attrition, civilian hardships, industrial paralysis, and the encirclement of the home islands. When all of these threads were pulled together, the picture was unmistakable. And this picture formed the backbone of the report, whose final pages contain the line, "No leader wanted to read." Inside the Navy Ministry, the report was spread across a long, polished table. Charts, graphs, and detailed tabulations lined its pages. Each section carried the weight of fact: cumulative ship losses, aircraft attrition, fuel depletion, production deficits, and manpower shortages. The analysts had carefully layered tactical realities, industrial capacities, and logistical constraints. The numbers converged with ruthless clarity. Japan could no longer project power across the Pacific. It could not contest carrier strikes. It could not prevent the bombing of its cities. And most critically, it could not envision any scenario in which American soil might be successfully invaded. The report's final paragraph, understated yet devastating, crystallized the conclusion: an invasion of the United States is impossible. Any attempt would be fatal to the empire. The language was clinical, but the implication was existential. For decades, the Imperial Navy had nurtured doctrines built around decisive engagements, fleet actions, and bold offensives. Those doctrines now collided with arithmetic, with reality, with a force too vast and inexorable to oppose. Senior officers leaned back, the quiet of the room amplifying the weight of the statement. Admiral Toyoda Somu, chief of the Navy General Staff, and his colleagues faced a ledger of failure not as a question of valor, but as a question of physics and production. No amount of courage, no skillful maneuver, no sacrifice could alter these facts. The room itself seemed to acknowledge the truth. The empire had reached the limits of its capabilities. Private conversations among generals and admirals revealed a complex mix of disbelief, resignation, and in some cases relief. For those who had recognized the strategic dead-end years earlier, the report confirmed what they had long feared: Japan was on a trajectory toward collapse. For others, the words were a shock. Some officers had imagined a final gamble, a concentrated fleet, a daring attack, or even a diversion to draw American forces into overextension. Now every one of those fantasies was rendered moot. Beyond the immediate leadership, the report had ripple effects throughout the military bureaucracy. Orders were modified to focus on homeland defense, kamikaze missions intensified, and resources were reallocated to delay, rather than defeat, the inevitable. Strategic planners realized that the empire's remaining hope lay not in conquest, but in prolonging resistance, turning American calculations of cost into a psychological weapon. The final, quiet realization settled in: Japan would not cross the Pacific again. Its battleships would remain harbored, its aircraft grounded for lack of fuel, and its strategic initiative permanently ceded. The United States, meanwhile, would continue to produce ships, planes, and bombs faster than Japan could replace even a fraction of what it had lost. The arithmetic of industrial power had become an unbreakable law, indifferent to ambition, courage, or sacrifice. This convergence of tactical defeats, industrial incapacity, and strategic inevitability completed the arc of the war's turning point. It was a conclusion not written in speeches, not declared in public, but recorded in a set of charts and numbers that left no room for interpretation. A mathematical certainty that carried the weight of history. As 1945 unfolded, the long-term consequences of Japan's acceptance of the report became increasingly evident. The empire's strategic posture hardened into a defensive crouch, yet the resources to sustain even this position were eroding daily. Fuel stocks dwindled, merchant shipping remained under constant threat from submarines, and aircraft numbers fell as maintenance backlogs and attrition took their toll. By the summer, the Imperial Navy was effectively immobilized, its remaining vessels confined to ports, unable to challenge the U.S. Pacific Fleet or defend convoys. This material weakness compounded the human cost. On the home islands, air raids intensified in scope and destructiveness. Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and other industrial centers faced relentless B-29 bombing campaigns. The civilian population, already suffering from food shortages and rationing, now confronted mass casualties and the collapse of urban infrastructure. Schools, hospitals, and factories were destroyed or rendered inoperative. The report's foresight regarding the home island's vulnerability had proved prescient. The inability to project power had shifted the battleground directly into the heart of Japan itself. Militarily, Japan's defensive strategy reflected the grim arithmetic of the report. Operation Ketsugo, designed to repel an American invasion of Kyushu, relied heavily on kamikaze attacks, coastal artillery, and underground fortifications. Yet even these measures could only slow the inevitable. American planners anticipated tens of thousands of Japanese casualties per beachhead while projecting manageable losses on the Allied side, a stark contrast to Japan's limited manpower. The report had essentially forced a pivot. Offensive ambition gave way entirely to delaying tactics, attritional resistance, and symbolic gestures of defiance. Politically, the recognition of strategic impotence contributed to internal turmoil. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki's cabinet operated under the shadow of inevitable defeat. Navigating between hardline militarists advocating continued resistance and moderates urging negotiation. Imperial correspondence and staff memos reflected the pressure to maintain national honor while confronting the stark reality. Japan's ability to challenge America's military or industrial power had vanished. The report crystallized this understanding, providing a shared, incontrovertible reference for decision-making at the highest levels. The psychological consequences extended to both military and civilian spheres. Among officers and bureaucrats, the report generated a pervasive sense of fatalism. Training exercises and defensive preparations were often conducted with meticulous rigor, but they were overshadowed by an awareness that the empire's survival was increasingly tenuous. Civilians internalized a similar message through escalating shortages, destruction of cities, and the visible absence of effective military defense. Morale, while sustained by ideology and nationalistic messaging, was being tested by undeniable reality. Finally, the report's conclusions shaped the post-war narrative and historical memory. Japan's inability to threaten the U.S. homeland and its eventual surrender were not mere consequences of bombs or battles alone. They were the culmination of an empirical reality first articulated in that data-driven assessment. Analysts, historians, and military scholars would later cite the report as the document that shifted Japan from offensive overreach to strategic desperation. Its legacy was enduring. It exemplified how cold, verifiable facts, industrial output, logistical limits, technological disparities can redefine the course of nations in total war. By the end of 1945, Japan's empire had collapsed. Cities lay in ruins, the military lay disbanded, and the nation faced occupation and reconstruction. The report that once stunned the high command had achieved its full effect. It forced recognition of reality, precipitated strategic recalibration, and marked the irreversible end of any hope of striking American soil. From operational tables to human experience, the war had entered its final, inescapable chapter. History often turns not in moments of dramatic heroism, but in quiet reckonings with reality. The report that declared invading America is suicide exemplifies this truth. It was not delivered with fanfare, nor heralded in victory or defeat. Instead, it arrived as an unflinching accounting, numbers, charts, and logistical truths that left no room for debate. For Japan's high command, it was a mirror reflecting the limits of ambition, courage, and strategy against the immensity of industrial and technological power. In many ways, the document marked the moment when total war collided with arithmetic. Battles, heroics, and daring maneuvers could still occur, but they were no longer decisive. The war's outcome had become predictable, governed less by individual valor than by production lines, fuel stockpiles, and the capacity to replace losses. The United States, with its vast factories and manpower, could endure attrition and convert it into an unstoppable momentum. Japan, even at the peak of its resolve, could not. Yet within this truth lay lessons far broader than the Pacific theater. The report demonstrates how human endeavor, no matter how fierce, is bounded by logistics, technology, and reality itself. Courage and ingenuity matter, but only when supported by infrastructure capable of sustaining them. It reminds us that wars are not won solely on the battlefield. They are won in workshops, shipyards, mines, and laboratories, long before the first shot is fired or the first plane takes off. For the men who received the report in Tokyo, for the sailors stranded at sea, for civilians enduring the raids on cities far from the front, the knowledge was sobering. It crystallized a nation's vulnerability, redirected strategy towards survival rather than conquest, and shaped decisions that would ultimately define surrender and reconstruction. It revealed the delicate balance between human will and material capability, a balance that continues to resonate in military planning and historical analysis today. The empire that once imagined it could cross the Pacific now faced the consequences of reality. And in that confrontation lies a universal truth, that understanding the full scope of one's limits, technological, industrial, and human, is not defeat in itself, but the first step toward measured, informed decisions in the face of impossible odds. In the quiet halls of Tokyo, amidst ink-stained charts and hushed calculations, Japan's leaders glimpsed that truth. They could no longer challenge the United States directly. They could only endure, adapt, and confront the consequences of choices made years before. And it is within that sobering understanding that history, measured not in victories alone, but in the clarity of its lessons, finds its most enduring voice.